This is the Fly Culture Podcast with Pete Tigers. If you're enjoying listening each week, please consider subscribing.
Hey everyone, welcome back to this week's Fly Culture Podcast. I hope you're all good. I hope you're getting the chance to get fishing. Perhaps you're chasing some grayling somewhere or other. Perhaps you're somewhere nice and warm and casting to a bonefish or something like that. But if not, I hope this podcast is the next best thing to being out on the water. Let's set the scene. The cast flies out. You mend upstream and start pulling. Strip, strip, strip. You're never prepared for the take, but instinctively set and the fish is on. You feel the weight of it and see the bend in your rod. Welcome to the world of streamer fishing. My guest today has written for Fly Culture about targeting large river trout with streamers, and I plan to delve into the world and learn a little bit about my guest's fishing career too. He's packed so much into it, so I'm really looking forward to learning about his fishing story, but also hopefully getting some really great tips as well about streamer fishing, which seems to have grown in popularity over the last few years or so. So it's a great pleasure to have Fred Brown along. He's written for Fly Culture, as I say, about streamer fishing as well in the past. So if you're a reader of the magazine, you're probably familiar with his name and the beautiful, huge, great fish he was catching on streamers. Fred, thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with me. How are you doing?
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good indeed. The rivers are starting to drop back, so possibly tomorrow it could be grayling time. Yeah. So are you keeping yourself busy? Are you managing to catch some fish? Are you doing some stuff?
Yeah, I am. I'm keeping myself busy, mainly at the moment, fly tying. Pretty much up in Scotland here, the salmon season is finished with a few exceptions, namely the Annan and the Tweed. But trout ends up here on the 6th of October. So I've stopped pestering those things. And yeah, I'm doing fly tying and just getting ready for next season, which is a long way away, but can't start too early.
And when you're fly tying, are you one of these people who, when you're at the vice, you sort of picture a lovely summer's evening and rising fish and you tie accordingly to that, or do you just tie and fill the gaps in your fly box?
Generally, I'm filling the gaps in my fly box. And this year, especially with the salmon, I've done a fair amount of experimentation with flies, colours, in various conditions, with some good results actually. So I've come up with a couple of patterns this year that have caught a fair few salmon in that sort of bumper mad 2-week period that we had in August, where we just had sort of hordes of silver running every river in Scotland, which was really great to see, but it only lasted for 2 weeks. We plugged away all season, but it was good to get those fish in those numbers so we could experiment with those different coloured flies and different sizes and see what they liked.
That brief 2 weeks coincided, or the ending of it coincided with my trip up to Scotland. So everything went dead about the moment I got there. So I missed out, but it was lovely seeing, lovely seeing back end as well, wasn't it? That there was,
yes, it was
that lift in the water and everything happened. I remember Duncan would be listening to this, and I was at Inverness Airport ready to go home and managed to see him as he sort of came in and waved to him. He managed to spot me. I said, I'll be there, and I waved to him, and he had a lift in water on the river he was fishing and managed to catch some fish, which was great to see. And it was great to see that in social media as well, wasn't it? That it's been a tough season.
It was, yeah. Yeah, it's been a really tough season. So we had quite a wet spring, but on a few rivers around Inverness, actually, the Findhorn especially, where I've done some work this year, we had a really great April and May. Just fish after fish running through, which was really great to see. And then a completely dry June up here, and stupid temperatures. So a lot of those spate rivers just dried up completely, and the fish stopped running until about August. And then when we had our that main run of fish, they just took advantage of those few days of rain and bombed up rivers. But on rivers like the Oikle, beforehand, they were getting lots of fish running and lots of fresh fish running in no water. So I was up that way just before this rain in August, and just the amount of fish in those pools, and fresh ones at that, just milling around, but not taking flies, just on survival mode. So that was really interesting to see this year. So everyone thinks that a fresh salmon's quite an easy fish to catch when they're about, obviously, but there were hundreds of fish in every pool, and these things just weren't taking anything, and they were just in survival mode. So it's been a really strange season. And then we had that rain, and they all came on the take, which was lovely, obviously, while it lasted. But then the autumn on the Tay, where I'm based, was pretty tough again. All the fish seemed to be concentrated into a few beats on the river, and they weren't spread up and down evenly. So those beats in the middle lower river that had those fish there did really well all the way through to the end of the middle of October, the end of the season. But everyone else sort of struggled a little bit. So it was right place, right time for most of the season, as is the way with fishing mostly. But it would be nice to see that consistency of fish coming through rather than those sporadic huge pods coming through.
And so for you, did that mean that the salmon fishing, when that wasn't really on, did you busy yourself with trout fishing? I know we're going to get on to the streamer side of it, but and as a result of that water being so low, and perhaps you doing a little bit more trout fishing than you might usually do or might want to do, how did you find your trout season as let's give it a score out of 10? How did you find that?
My trout season personally actually was really tough. To give it a score out of 10, it started off well. It was probably pretty average, actually, a 4 or a 5, so out of 10, which is pretty poor. But I didn't actually do that much targeting them this year. And because, again, we had such low water conditions, and it was so hot, and because I like throwing streamers, I was having to go a bit more nocturnal with my my tactics. So here in sort of May, June, July time, it doesn't really get dark, and you need those fading light conditions for those big boys, those bigger fish, certainly to come out of their hiding holes during where they've been hiding away from the bright sun during the day. So. On a few days I would head out at sort of 11:30 mid to midnight and give it a couple of hours in the sort of fading light there. But I got into a couple of nice fish early season. One notable fish in Cumbria, but just before I moved up here. And that was a lovely fish, really old, sort of gnarly looking thing. Has obviously been around for a really long time, but was still very thin after spawning. But she put on an amazing fight, and that was about 4 pounds actually, that fish, which I class as sort of a good fish in the UK for streamers. But obviously, when I'm out there targeting them, I'm really after the sort of 5 to 10 pounders. Not that I've come into contact with a 10-pounder yet, but I'm sure they're there. So that's the reason for fishing them.
Cool. We'll come on to the streamers shortly. And already where the conversation is going, we've talked salmon, we've talked trout. Would it be fair to say that although we're circling around streamers, would it be fair to say you're an all-round fly angler and you enjoy every aspect of it?
Yeah, definitely. I was brought up trout fishing, and then going salmon fishing once a year on the River Blackwater in Ireland. So from a very early age, I started when I was 4, and the giddy had me casting on the bank relentlessly, trip after trip, just to practice and get to learn it. And then I remember catching my first brown trout on a dry fly, and I must have been 4 or 5 then. And then it's progressed from there, really. But I love fishing for everything that sort of has an adipose fin, basically. So salmon, sea trout, and brownies. And latterly, sort of in the last few years, I've more enjoyed fishing those larger northern rivers, mainly sort of Yorkshire, Cumbria, and the borders as well. I find that at the moment the most exciting fishing for me, whether it is salmon, sea trout, or brownies. Yeah.
And where were you learning to your trout fishing? Where were you, those first sort of steps? You said you started fishing at 4. Was that sort of a holiday sort of thing, and then that developed? And was there a conscious, you were aware that, yeah, this is something I do and I'm really into? Can you tell when that sort of came around for you, and where you were fishing too?
Yeah, I mean, I don't ever remember not having fishing in my life, basically. From the get-go. Yeah, I was fishing with my dad. My dad taught me to fly fish mainly. And I spent my childhood sort of being taken around by my family because my dad worked abroad. So I grew up in Japan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So we'd go on family holidays, which would often involve fishing. So I was lucky enough to, when we were living in Asia, to go to some amazing places. I'm very fortunate to fish. Places like New Zealand, fished Taupo, sorry, and the Huri River as well, which is in the South Island. I've also, fished in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef, and all over those places. But one common factor through all of that has been it's pretty much always been fly fishing for me. I never really started with the course stuff, although I had a few lessons here and there, course fishing. But for me, it was always about fly fishing, and I think that was probably because getting that take on a dry fly when I was so young. I can still remember it now. 27, 28 years later, that's still firmly stuck in my mind. So. Yeah, very, very fortunate to grow up in those places and fish the destinations that I've fished. But then sort of in my early teens, I was sent to boarding school in Somerset and actually set up a fly fishing club there. And got to fish Chew and Blagton a lot for the trout there. Never really went piking, actually, which was a shame now because it is so popular. But yeah, I fished that, and my uncle actually had a trout farm in the Chalk Valley, and then latterly ran Manningford trout fishery for a while. So I was very lucky to be able to go and fish that, the fishery as well as the Upper Avon, which runs past Manningford fishery there. So yeah, I did that through school. Fished a lot of the chalk streams, and fished the Avon, the Tess, the Itchen. Did a fair amount of fishing on those rivers actually, and then I think what it all changed for me was when I went up to university for a little bit, although I didn't last very long. But I went up to university in Leeds, and sort of got to know the Yorkshire Dales and the rivers up there. So it was just it's a completely different world up there. Big open rivers. It felt much wilder to me. And started going fishing on the wharf and the Ure and places like that, and started catching some slightly better fish too. And that's just sort of snowballed the effect on my obsession with those rivers, and the bigger rivers that we've got in the UK. And then, well, whilst I was at university, I got the opportunity to go and run a little business out in Mozambique, which was a saltwater fly fishing business. And yeah, I was out there for 3 years, which was an amazing experience. Very varied fishing, and it's not what you think of when you think of a sort of saltwater destination. A lot of people, when I say that, think of a flat skiff and nice shallow water. But where I was in the Basruto archipelago wasn't like that. We had an inshore fishery as such, which was inside the archipelago. But the problem with where we were and inside the archipelago was the huge amounts of tidal movement that we get in, or that we got there. Up to sort of 5-6 meters of tide in the spring tide. So really too much for fish to hold in those shallow areas for too long. And also the local fishing pressure on those areas was was pretty tough as well. So there just weren't that many fish inside the shallow flats. Although we had sandbars and flats and stuff, there weren't many things on them. Most of the fishing was outside the archipelago, and all the way down the archipelago, you have a reef system interspersed by sandy trenches and things like that. And that's where the bulk of our fishing took place. So we had those reef systems, which sort of all between 2 and 20 meters of water. And then out in the deeper sea, we had sort of those deeper reefs starting from 20 meters all the way through to hundreds of meters, really. And I targeted fish out there on all methods, but mainly fly fishing and topwater stick baiting and lures for the big pelagics and the GTs and things like that.
GTs are a fish I've yet to tangle with. I've seen them. I've caught bluefin, which I enjoyed immensely. And if the saltwater anglers listening, I think I wrote a piece somewhere on the online magazine saying that bonefish are like Nijinsky and trevally are more like Mike Tyson. And having not sort of experienced giant trevally, I would think they're probably Mike Tyson plus, aren't they? They're extraordinary fish.
Yeah, that they are. Well, yeah. They're amazing fish and just brutes. Everyone's seen the clips of them taking birds out the air in the Seychelles. They are, and they're intelligent fish as well. They're not stupid. They're not easy. So you can't just go out and expect to catch a whole handful. You've got to, certainly in Mozambique where we were, you have to fish the tides, fish the right reef systems, fish the right areas where the bait's being funneled up into these pressure wellings, and find those ambush points. But when they were on, with low pressure systems and thunderstorms about and stuff, it could have been incredible fishing. Takes right close to the boat, and some amazing big fish too. The biggest fish, or the biggest giant trevally that I saw out there, was just under 60 kilos, 56, 57 kilos, which is a huge fish. It was 132 centimeters long, I think. So just an absolute giant of a thing. And 8 to 200 gram stick bait like it was nothing. So that's a 12, 13 inch stick bait that's just getting inhaled by this fish. So then targeting them on fly was actually quite a daunting process, especially on those shallow reef systems. Fine if we were fishing those deep reef systems, you never really knew what was going to grab your fly on those deep reef systems. But top water shallow GTs was intimidating. Expect burnt fingers, broken fly lines. Everybody says this, but it's true. They are just absolute brutes. Don't think I've ever experienced power from a fish of that size. They averaged in Mozambique around 20 kilos, which is a really great fish. 40 to 50 pounds, around the meter length. So, yeah, an amazing place. And when you're cooking them in 2 meters of water, you just got to hold on. Most of the time, you're bending out 6-0 hooks. So, really incredible fish to target. Very exciting, but again, can be sort of hours of boredom casting into bait and just not being there. So they can be very temperamental too.
Wow. And Mozambique, thinking about it as well, the GTs, I guess, will be a pull enough. And you were saying mainly fly fishing and stick bait, etc. From a fly fishing perspective then, and somebody who's guiding, I suspect Mozambique isn't on the radar for your typical fly angler. Did that mean that you would get better quality fly anglers, so it was easier? They understood how hard you had to work for the fish. They understood how to cover the fish. Would that be fair to say that you were getting better than, or a different sort of fly angler really than a holidaying angler?
Yeah, it was a mixture, because I was my own company, but I was based at a lodge. So I used to get my own clients and my own client base coming to fish with me sort of multiple times a year. And many of those guys would be from Zimbabwe or South Africa, because it's just a nice, easy drive for those guys to get there. It's sort of 8 hours from Harare and 8 hours from northern South Africa as well. So not too bad in African terms. But then with the lodge guests, a lot of them hadn't fished before, or you get your English fly fisherman who said, done lots of chalk stream or salmon fishing, and you go, okay, but this is slightly different. It's a bit of a different caliber. So a real mixture of people actually. With those guys who, from the lodge, you'd have to sort of kind of manage their expectations a little bit more. And it wasn't always the fly gear that I broke out with them. Although, some of the fly fishing is very easy, and people caught, their first fish on fly with me, after having 2 drops or 2 casts, on the fly. So, but a lot of my regulars from Zimbabwe and South Africa, they were mainly fly fishermen and the top water plugging guys. So they would be, been coming to the archipelago for, so in some cases, 30 years. So they really knew how the fishery worked, and you actually knew the area probably better than me in some circumstances. But we worked together well, and we caught some amazing fish. So just had to manage and every guest differently, and see how these, how the day was faring as well. Sometimes it could be very easy and it took 30 seconds to catch a fish, but other times, you struggle and you battle away, even out in the sea where you just expect, there to be thousands of fish.
And that's the sign of a good guy, being able to manage a day according to the customer's skill set, which is pleasing for me to hear. I'm going to rewind a tiny bit, because you said university in Leeds didn't work out for you and you ended up in Mozambique. Does that mean that you realised fishing was a career that you wanted to explore? Was that a difficult decision to make? And being at university, speaking to parents about it, was that a difficult conversation, and dropping out of uni to follow your dream? Was that a hard decision?
No, I think for me, I hadn't really, when I was at university, I hadn't really realised that I could have made a career out of fly fishing. And it was by chance going to Mozambique on the family holiday where we got talking with my predecessor, this chap called Graham Pollard. And I just said to him, "This is my dream job. This is absolutely incredible. How do I do this? How do I get into it?" And I was probably 19, 20 at the time. Yeah, about 19 or 20. And he said, "Look, give me your contact details and I'll give you a ring." So during my sort of first semester of my second year, having not really gone to university at all in my first year, actually completely flunked my first year and then changed course. I got a phone call one morning, and it was Graham, and he said, "If you want to come out and do this, then I'm leaving, and I think you'd be a great person to take over the business." And I can't really remember how it went with my parents. I think my dad was pretty supportive. I think my mum was maybe a little bit more hesitant, but still very supportive too. And they just, strangely at the age of 20, let me go off and do it. It was a very, very steep learning curve. I went from Headingley to a little tiny island off the coast of Mozambique, which was pretty daunting, and I think would have been incredibly daunting had I not spent a lot of time in Africa growing up, because my dad was brought up in Africa. We've spent time as a family going there over the last 20 years or so, been going holiday there, so it wasn't that foreign to me, and it sort of all felt quite natural when I got there. And there was a fairly intense training period where Graham, showed me the reef systems, where to go in certain tides, where not to go in certain tides, and that lasted 3 months, and then I was pushed out into the Indian Ocean and told to get on with it. Very steep learning curve. I made some mistakes. But you learn from making mistakes, and a couple of close calls as well with bad weather and squalls and all that sort of stuff. I mean, an incredibly dangerous area to work in, Mozambique, with the reef systems, the constant changing of the sandbars and things like that. So always learning, as everyone is with fishing every day. You make mistakes, you don't make them again. and you learn from them and go on. But yeah, an amazing time. I wouldn't have changed it at all.
And did you find that deep end put you in good stead, and it's something that you carry on with your career now, in your fishing career, and when you're fishing, how you assess things possibly a little bit more quickly and make changes accordingly? Did you notice that? And that was a really important part for you, your development as a fly angler.
Yeah, it taught me a massive amount, and you being out on the sea pretty much every day, you do start to notice subtle changes very, very quickly. So little tidal move, little pressure upwellings, tiny little sort of giveaways that a lot of people miss. And that's definitely come on to, and where I've learned, especially I think with my fishing now in freshwater and rivers, is noticing more subtle elements in rivers. So different lies and places where I wouldn't necessarily just glance by. Before I went out to Mozambique, little spots now and condition changes and all that sort of stuff that I'm keying into. For sure. It's made me very aware of the weather as well, and what goes on, pressure changes, and feeling atmospherics and stuff like that. So yeah, it's I think the most important thing I learned from there was being especially careful. Even on rivers and things, it can all go very quickly wrong. But also then picking up that change in conditions and how it's affecting fish. Definitely.
I think having worked in it professionally, like you say, spotting those little things and adapting or changing more quickly is something I noticed. It fascinated me that you mentioned about changes in pressure. And even when I was on the river every single day working, I'd say, do you feel it feels different now? And you pick up on the slightest little thing that allows you to make a small change that could make a big difference. And that's something I still notice when I'm fishing myself or fishing with a friend even, that I'll make a change very, very quickly rather than doing what worked last time, or when you even get into a pool.
Yes.
Those little things, aren't they? They really do mean something. And yeah.
They do, yeah, absolutely. I'm the same sort of fisherman where if something's not working right away, or not right away, but within 10 minutes or so, I'm changing straight away. And that's whether it's fly color, or if it's size, or if it's sinking line or non-sinking line, or whatever you're doing. I'm constantly thinking about, okay, even different pools on the same river, working my way down, I'll be doing different things in every single pool. And that's with both salmon fishing and actually brownies. I'm constantly thinking about how I can do something slightly differently, or if a pool has been fished 2 or 3 times that morning or day, find out how it was fished, or if you've seen it, then do something completely different. Because especially with those salmon, watching flies just come over gradually over their heads, multiple times through a day, they just completely tune off to them. And I've seen salmon this season and in seasons gone by, they just sink lower in the water column, don't even give a moment's notice to those flies. So it's all helped massively. And again, actually another thing, rambling on, with the GTs, getting them to chase your fly or your stick bait more aggressively as you're bringing the fly, or retrieving, or winding in if you're spinning. So that's equated to brown trout with streamers. I quite often start with a nice fast retrieve as soon as that fly hits the water. Slow it down mid-swing when you've got that nice big belly, or your fly is starting to move quite quickly. So you slow down your retrieve, the fly's got its most speed, but then again at the end of the retrieve, get very, very quick with your retrieve again. And that sort of teasing the fish up through the water is, I think, a great way of getting takes through multiple different species. Fishing that swing or retrieve, or however you're doing it, varying up the speeds during that swing, or drift of the fly, or whatever it is. I think that can make a huge difference. Especially with the GTs, if you're starting off slow and you get a boil and no connection, then you tease them up and get the lure working more fast and more quickly, and that fish is more likely to explode on it.
Yeah. There's some good points there, and in our own little small way with these podcasts, I hope what it's helped to do, and this has sort of backed it up some more as well, is to get people to think a little bit about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And I think that helps us all become better anglers. And like you say, with salmon or whatever species, I immediately try and think, right, what can I do differently that the fish may not have seen before? And I think in all walks of the fishing that I do, I'm consistently assessing, do I need to change this? Do I need to change that? Why did that happen? Why didn't that happen? And I think if we ask ourselves these sorts of questions, it does help us all perhaps become slightly better anglers as a result of it. But you've worked in
Definitely, yeah.
You've worked in fishing, and you said, I think Mozambique was 3 years. It sounds, and when you first looked at it, it was your dream job. And it's easy when you're the other side of the fence, isn't it, that it looks a fantastic job. When you're actually inside it, it's bloody hard work, and working in fishing is really hard work too, isn't it? And was that a reason why after 3 years you thought, right, time for something different and I need to step out? Or had you got it out your system? How did that sort of play out for you?
Yeah, Mozambique was the end of Mozambique was a combination of things for me. I think, firstly, life out there was difficult, very remote, and just difficult getting hold of supplies, tackle, all this sort of thing. And I think the second thing was that the lodge that I was based at, they were really sort of going through a tough time, change of ownership and all that. So the guests had really dropped off. So when I didn't have my regular clients coming up or coming across from Zimbabwe, I really didn't have anyone to take fishing. And I remember my last sort of few weeks there actually just spending time on the water by myself, which was great. But I think the main reason for leaving was life in Mozambique was tough, very difficult to live alongside, poverty on that level. You get to see some pretty unpleasant things, unfortunately, but that's all part of life out there. And the island that I was living on, had 10,000 people living on it. But none of those houses that those people live in had running water or electricity. These are guys who are living off less than $1 a day. So seeing that and being exposed to that for 3 years, also became quite tricky and quite difficult to cope with. So another thing actually as well was rescuing local dhows, fishermen who aren't going out for fun or anything. They're going out because they need to survive. So they would go out in pretty much all weather, and we got some really gruesome weather out there when I was out there. So rescuing those guys, and it's the sort of stress of employing staff out there as well, and all of that combined together, I think it's sort of just run its course. And also that I felt that the fishery was declining, unfortunately, and very sadly, actually. But there just seemed to be a lot more commercial operations out there. We had some of these, the Chinese and Spanish trawlers coming closer and closer into the national parks. But then also, big sort of foreign countries coming in and buying all these local fishermen, boats and equipment and everything to go and sit on these reefs, plunder the reefs full of all the reef fish, and then they'd be shipped off to China to be sold out there and eaten out there. So it took a real whacking. But I think in the last, it's been sort of 7 or 8 years since I was there. But I think in the last couple of years they've started to really cut down on that. But it's difficult in a country like that where there is so much corruption to monitor anything and police anything that effectively, and especially in such a huge area with no infrastructure, no tarmac roads, no electricity. And when I first went out there were no mobile phones either. So it was, completely cut off from everything. And we only had electricity at certain points of the day in my accommodation. So, very, very different life. And, just going to the shops wasn't an easy task either. It was hopping in the boat, driving an hour across the mainland, hiring a car or getting a taxi for a day, going around doing my chores and things. So, it was an all-day thing, just going to the shops, not to mention all the fuel costs and things like that, because, getting fuel across the islands was a headache as well. And, clean fuel at that too. The amount of times I had dirty fuel through my engines and them going wrong and, going wrong out at sea as well. It's just a lot of logistics go on behind the scenes, which a lot of guests don't realize. It's not just going out and fishing and catching fish, as you know. There's a lot of work that goes in, rigging up tackle and baits, and getting it all there to Mozambique in the first place was difficult enough. So it was, I think, jumping straight in the deep end with Mozambique. But it hasn't put me off guiding at all. And the reason I came back, for all those reasons, I came back and then thought, well, I may as well try London for a little bit. And I actually got a job in shipping as a marine underwriter, which is very different. And I'd never really seen myself or been interested in marine underwriting or shipping or anything like that. But found myself there and interviewed for a company, and I just thought, maybe try and save a little bit of money, which was wishful thinking in London. But I did that for 3 years, and this was actually after working at Rob Gents in Stockbridge for about 18 months, just under 18 months. So I worked there, and I wanted to do some guiding on the chalk streams, but I didn't. It was either or with the shop. So I chose the shop as that was a more sort of stable year-round form of income. So, and sort of bouncing backwards and forwards, I think, between fishing and real jobs has mainly been because of money and financial issues. So, in Mozambique, I was making a comfortable living and loving what I was doing. It was just the location was a very difficult place to live. So I thought, okay, I'll come back to London, earn a bit of money, save it, hopefully, and then do some guiding in the UK. And that just didn't happen as quickly as I hoped, really. I did 3 and a bit, 3, nearly 4 years as a marine underwriter, and then actually just got completely disillusioned with living, paying rent and living in London, and just all my incomings going on just surviving in London, and that was frustrating. So I actually took some time off. When was it? It must have been about 2018. I took some time off. I went fishing in Cumbria and the Borders for pretty much the whole of September, just the last month of the trout season. And I'd been fishing streamers for a couple of seasons prior to that, but I just went up on a sole focused streamer, see what I could find in a month's fishing, and sort of live out my car for a little bit and just sort of trout bum around, really, and experiment. So that's sort of a bit of a ramble, but that's my
That's really cool.
fishing life in the last few years.
That's really cool, and you segued us beautifully into streamers as well. So you saved me having to do that as well. And I guess part of that, and we're going to move on to streamers now, but I guess the adjustment from Mozambique to London must have been quite an extreme. And the seeds, I guess, had already been set, and I guess that's why you're in Scotland now. But you talked about streamers and focusing on those, and you said, 2018, 2019, and I'd be interested to know where you discovered them. And I remember the first time I threw a streamer was some 25 years ago, and it was on the Colorado River. And we'd bummed a day, my buddy Ray and I bummed a day to get on a stretch of the Colorado where there were obviously trout further up the river there. And we had to hire a guide to get onto this bit of water, and I'm the worst person in the world to guide, not because I'll be a pain in the arse to the guide, but just purely I want to go and figure it out. And so, and he said, try a streamer, and I remember exactly, I can close my eyes now and imagine where I was on that bit of water when I got that first whack from a fish. And that was it. And then it's been fascinating to see, it's been something ingrained in the American fishing psyche for quite some time, yet it's sort of, it flickers a little bit over here and then has really got going. I'm sure that's aided by social media and the awesome names for streamer flies as well. Where did it come to you? How did you discover, and where did you first start showing an interest in pulling streamers?
So I think the initial interest in streamers was to try and emulate those big aggressive takes that we were getting in Mozambique from saltwater fish in freshwater. And for me, it happened, I can also remember it very clearly, one afternoon on the Usk. I can't remember what beat we were on, but we'd fished, normal conventional dries and nymphs throughout the day and caught a couple of, nice little fish, up to 1.5 pounds and that. And I remember it was early season as well. It was April. And I was fishing an 8.5 foot full weight. It was getting towards the end of the day. The light was fading. And throughout the day, it'd been sort of raining. So we had a slight little lift, and the water had gone noticeably off color as well. So I just thought, stuff it. I'll put on a muddler minnow and I'll strip it back as fast as I can. I mean, a muddler minnow, which is sort of 3 inches long, not an old traditional one. And I can't remember where I picked it up from. Anyway, I started chucking it in towards the bank and on the other side of the river and stripping it across the river. And I just remember a vortex opening up in the river and my fly just getting absolutely engulfed by this. Now, now I think about it, it's probably wasn't as big as I thought it was, but just amazing to see, a 2.5 to 3 pound wild Usk brownie with not a care in the world except for just wanting to kill that fly. And so visually as well, that's where everything changed for me. And the fight was incredible as well. It took me down this fast rapid and jumped a couple of times. And yeah, that's when it all changed for me. And I started researching much, much harder into the guys in America who do this fishing and have done this fishing for a very, very long time. So there's Charlie Craven, Kelly Gallup, Mike Schmidt, all these guys are just my heroes. And actually, closer to home, there's a guy in Ireland, in Dublin, called Keith McDonald, who also catches some very, very large fish on streamers in Ireland as well. So I'd love to get over and fish with him as well at some stage. But it was, once I caught that first fish on a streamer, it was just, I had to do it again, and I had to catch bigger and bigger fish. And that sort of led me away from Wales, rightly or wrongly. I always assumed the north of England with slightly bigger wild brown trout than Wales. Yes, I know you get some absolutely enormous fish on the TAF and the Tor and places like that. But they've all, I think, been introduced at some stage in their life, and they are, for all intents and purposes, wild fish, but they don't have that sort of fine dot patterns that the Cumbrian and the Yorkshire brownies have, and the Annan and the Clyde as well. Those fish are just incredibly big, and they're just spectacular to look at. And I just got completely obsessed with those fish, especially in the Eden system and the Ure system as well. Just some absolute donkeys in there. And trying to get them to eat a big articulated fly or a small little minnow pattern or something like that can be very challenging, very visual, and very rewarding too.
Cool. Keith McDonald, if anyone reads Fly Culture, his trout, some of those wonderful trout he's caught on streamers appear in the front of the magazine as well. I think we've had his fishing there a couple of times, which are really, really cool. What I'd like to do is drill down, because for me, streamers are something I can use, but I don't go out to say I'm going to have a day of streamer fishing generally, unless conditions for me dictate it. If you are setting up, would you talk to me about what weight of rod you're using, what's density of fly line, tippet length and strength? Can you give us an idea of if we're going to go look for some of these fish on? Because one of the interesting things as well is that, yes, you can find, and I've been fortunate on my home rivers to catch some sizable trout on dry flies, yet I think the biggest I've caught has been on a streamer because the conditions were right for me. So I decided, or I elected that as the correct way to tackle them then. But if you're going to do it for the day, what do you do? And is that mindset, okay, this is what I'm going to do today, rather than, right, let's give the streamer a go because the dry hasn't worked or whatever it is? What is the mindset and what is the tackle setup?
Yeah, for me, generally in the last few seasons, I've been saying, right, streamer fishing, targeting brownies, and if I'm on a medium-sized river like the Upper Ure or the Upper Eden, then I would go with a 7-weight 10-foot rod, and in fine water you can actually get away with a floating line. But what I've started doing in recent seasons is actually going to these single-handed Skagit lines. So the OPSTs, the Rio Trout Skagit, and all that sort of stuff, which have got really aggressive front tapers on them. And then you can put your sort of 7.5 foot of Sink 6 or Sink 4 or Sink 2 or whatever you want on top of those. And those lines help with turning over those bigger flies and those heavier flies that I'm using. But then if I'm on a big river, so I've started doing this because the Tay is just out my front door. I started fishing on the Tay, which is a massive river, and there I will fish a full sunk line, but again with a very aggressive front taper. So the Airflow, Kelly Gallup, streamer maxes, and all the shovel heads, those lines, they are invaluable for that sort of fishing. And it's not that you're trying to sort of sink the fly too deep, because I don't think that's generally an issue unless it's really, really cold. But you're just trying to get that fly to sort of hang neutrally, because you don't have any bait fish sort of going up or down quickly in the water column. They're gonna hang there rather than plummeting like a stone unnaturally. So those full floating, 200, 250 grain lines, full sunk, are just getting that fly to hold, 1.5 foot, maybe 2 foot if you're lucky, in the water. And when a big trout wants to eat a fly, leader length just doesn't matter. So if I'm fishing on the Tay for trout, I'll be using a 3-foot leader maximum of probably 15 to 20 pound fluorocarbon. And that's in good water heights as well. And then, if I'm fishing those slightly more narrow stretches of river, the topper systems, Devon, the Don, the Annan, the Clyde, places like that, then I'll switch to predominantly a full floating line, but with a sink tip, depending on conditions. So if it's really cold, you've got to get the fly to slow down, because those fish are going to be lethargic, and fish slightly bigger patterns as well, to get them more interested in moving to eat. And then in low water conditions, downsize everything. Go with a little 8.5 foot 5 weight or a 9 foot 6 weight or something like that, and fish your way upstream rather than downstream. And everyone thinks there's a common misconception, I think, that I found with fishing streamers, is everybody wants to swing them, which isn't necessarily right. Yes, don't get me wrong, the swing will still catch fish, but I find casting perpendicular to the current and mending whichever way you want, depending on the situation you're in, and getting that fly working down and across rather than up and across is a far more effective way of catching fish, because a lot of prey, your grayling, young brown trout, sculpins, all that sort of stuff, they flee downstream with the current. It's just more efficient for them. So that's representing it and getting your fly to move that way, I think, is a far more effective way of picking up fish that way.
That's interesting you mentioned that. I know I was asked to contribute something about streamers, and I throw almost up a bit, as you're saying, let it come level with me and then move it from there. And I'm working in my mind that I'm bringing it across in front of the fish's face. Yes, I will down and across it as well. But that, for me, if I've got the room to do it, is my preferred method of doing it. Leader length, I think, is kind of interesting, and you use the word neutral, because if you're using a floating line and a longer leader as well, that fly is going to come right up. So you're not going to get that 3 foot, are you? Unless you're using a super heavy fly. So I think that's a valuable point as well. And coloration. Sorry, go on, Fred, you were going to say something.
No, I was just going to say that, I think the only time that I would use a long leader, and the only time you could get away with using a long leader, is in low water conditions, like we've had for most of the summer. So full floating line and tiny little flies as well. I mean, tiny in streamer terms. So probably on a size 8 smallest, single little minnow or something. And then that is quite easy to cast with no weighting or anything. So probably a 10 to 12 foot leader in that circumstance.
Yeah. And you've talked about patterns as well, and you've been playing with patterns. And one of the things I've noticed, and I got close to it, is that when I'm fishing for salmon, because we tend to have a little bit of colour in the water, black and yellow is usually the best sort of pattern. And I notice, yes, you sometimes, and I obviously don't target them, I sometimes pick up trout swinging the fly. But if I move that same salmon fly, I can, not easily, but I know I've got a pretty good chance that I'm going to bump a trout that way. Yeah. Black and yellow as a colour for a trout dedicated streamer, is that something you've explored?
I think black certainly as a standalone is great, but black and yellow together I haven't done. Yellow on it by itself, absolutely. Fish a lot of pure yellow flies. I think the closest to black and yellow that I can get to is brown and yellow, and that's when I'm imitating young brown trout. So I think that's probably. I don't think the trout are going to see the black and the brown too differently. So it's just it's that contrast of colours, I think, which is the important thing in those certain darker, dirtier water conditions. You need those colours, and for one of those colours to pop, and the other colour to melt away into the natural colour of the river.
And you talked about those darker, dirtier colours, as I've implied. That I like to fish when I can't fish for salmon, but it's still too high to target a fish on a dry fly. Are you fishing streamers any condition?
I have been for just because I've been experimenting, but there are definitely conditions which favour streamer fishing, and that, as you say, that high coloured river, especially just on the lift as well, when all those bait fish are getting funneled out of their hidey holes and they're being pushed into the main current by the increasing flow of the river. That's when those big trout really get on the munch, and they go out into, there's slightly deeper lanes, but obviously not too deep because they're having to work against more current. But that's when I've had some of my best fishing, on just as the river's rising, and you get those flies in there, fish the margins, those back eddies, structure, all that sort of stuff. But I found that all my biggest trout have come from very shallow pockets of water, from probably a foot of water to 3 foot of water maximum. I've never caught a big brownie in a deep pool before, deep, slow moving pool, during the day. At night, it's a totally different matter.
Yeah. And I guess summertime as well, when those temperatures go up, the water temperatures go up, I guess they're probably, unless you're going out at night time and becoming a nocturnal streamer fisherman, that chances of success that way are going to be a little bit harder. A trout's not really going to chase down a streamer in warm water conditions, I guess, are they?
No, they're a bit more reluctant to chase in warm, bright conditions. But I remember last season, it was last season. Yeah, it was last season. In June, me and my flatmate, who I used to live with in London, we went up to Yorkshire. It wasn't Yorkshire, it was Cumbria. And we had a nice sort of warm, dirty flood. It wasn't even a flood, just a rise of probably a foot, just under a foot, 8 inches or something. And it was a sort of tea colour to it, not with milk, but so you could still see into the water about a foot or so. But it was warm, and what I noticed straight away was I put my hand in the river, and it was like sort of 15, 16 degrees, and I thought, oh, this is going to be poor. But no, it was just incredible. Fish were nymphing. We could see fish nymphing in the shallows. We could see fish rising. And the strange thing about that day was, I was casting some quite big patterns to rising fish, fish eating insects, and then casting up to these things with bait fish imitations, and they were absolutely crunching them. It was just incredible. I couldn't stop catching fish. And pretty much all my fish came on a muddler minnow, on an intermediate tip, and just casting wherever I could in the river and covering fish, upstream, downstream, swinging, stripped across the water. It didn't matter. But I landed 4 belters in a sort of 24-hour period. 3, 4, and then the biggest was just over 6 pounds. And I think that's ideal conditions. The warm flood, not the overhead conditions. The overhead conditions were terrible. It was bright, it was hot, it was sunny, but it was just that colour of the water which had got the fish really, really amped up. So, and the pressure was increasing as well, which is also sort of strange for the big fish to come out in those conditions. And I think it was just on the back of that flood that they were all riled up, and there must have been a lot of food coming down for them, a lot of bait fish being swept down as well. So, it was a mad sort of evening and early morning. I think we landed 6 or 7 fish over 3.5 pounds, which was incredible.
Wow. And interesting what you say about the river coming up. I've always had this theory that the fish will come on the feed because I'm sure they can detect they may not be able to feed for a little bit, so they come on as the river's coming up. And of course, if it has been murky, which it can be for a little while on our river, that they don't get to feed for a bit, so they come back on. So they seem primo times. You've obviously mentioned areas and stuff, but streamers will work on any sort of freestone river, well, any river system really, but I think of them more as freestone, spate river tactics more than anything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
And even on small streams here in Devon, I'll fish them. They're a lighter fly. I love the Stillwater fulling meal snake pattern that works
Yeah,
fabulous. The articulation there, the way that it moves is absolutely fabulous from that point of view. So that's caught me sea
it
trout in
is. Yeah.
Denmark. It's been a great one. Relatively easy to cast because it's only got B-chain eyes. I don't tend to, on the
Hmm.
smaller streams, worry too much about because it's a small drift. But what it's taught me
Exactly. Yeah.
is even small fish will come and try and whack it. Sometimes they'll whack it,
Mm.
and then sometimes, and I think I've described this before on another podcast, they'll almost sort of escort it out of their territory without biting it.
Yes.
And have you observed that
Yeah.
sort of behavior? Yeah.
I have. I've seen a couple of different instances. Yes, small trout taking big streamers bigger than them sometimes, and that's just, I think, a pretty ambitious trout, which I don't disagree with. He's going to go places and get big, hopefully. But yeah, with fish, being aggressive towards other fish or flies, and I've seen loads of different instances where one on the Annan where this big resident brownie was visibly kicking off sea trout who were coming into his pool. So he was chasing him out the tail downstream and then coming back up through the head of the next pool into his tail again. And then anytime a new fish came anywhere near him, he was chasing them back down again. And I put a fly over him as well, and he chased it, but he wouldn't take. He was just chasing. Yeah, I got a couple of opportunities at him, and he chased, and he wouldn't take it. So they can be very strange. I've seen also on the Ure, I've seen trout sort of hoarding and almost like sheepdogging minnows into the shallows, and then they sit there, with their completely motionless, just with a couple of twitches, their fins, their pectoral fins, their anal fins, and their tail, their dorsal fin, keeping them upright, and they just launch themselves out of nowhere, off drop offs and things into centimeters of water. Sometimes these fish's backs are out of the water, and minnows go flying, and it's incredible. So if you can just sit and watch the river, and if you notice minnows in the shallows, and you've got a drop off there, or there's quite often trout lurking on those drop offs. So if you put a little minnow pattern through in those instances, you got a good chance in getting them, and especially in bright conditions. I remember doing that one Easter, I think 2019, just before COVID. Went up to Yorkshire, and it was an Easter weekend heat wave. We had balmy weather, sort of mid-20s, and bright sun all day. And I got to my stretcher river, and I just saw little bow waves in the shallows, and I thought, what on earth is going on here? Swells, and it took me a while to actually physically see it up close. I poked my head over a high bank, and I just saw this trout sitting there twitching. I think I put it on my Instagram page, actually. And suddenly he just goes into the middle of the minnows, and you see him crunching down on this minnow, and then he slinks down off into the depths again. But incredible to see, incredible behavior to see. And I didn't actually cast a line for that morning while they were doing that. I just watched them because I was fascinated.
Nice. One of the things I meant to talk about when we were talking about the tackle and stuff like that I use a loop knot. I think it's a saltwater Homer Rhodes knot to attach my streamer for better articulation. Would you subscribe to that as well?
I do exactly the same. I call it a Rapala knot, loop knot, non-slip loop knot. And that gives my flies, I think, a better, as you say, movement in the water. I use that for everything. And I actually use that for salmon fishing now as well, when I'm fishing doubles and singles.
Me too. Yeah, me too. Also, I wanted to ask you a little bit about patterns themselves, because you've mentioned muddler minnow a fair bit. But do we need lots of patterns? Are there sort of some staple favourites? But I assume in blacks, greens, and like you say, some yellows, that would probably cover it. It doesn't really matter too much, does it?
Yeah, it really doesn't matter. Even if you just want to go and experiment on your local river, I would start with your trout lures for still waters. Main colours would be black, olive, brown. Grey is quite a good one. White as well. So I mean, it's the same with all fishing. Bright conditions, bright fly. Dark conditions, dark fly. So my go-to at night is black and red. Whether that's a fly that's fishing in the water or a mouse pattern or something on the surface. It doesn't matter what color it is, but just getting that sort of wake and that V of that fly can really trigger them. And then bright conditions, downsize and fish brighter colors. So your whites, your grays, maybe even chartreuse works in bright conditions, but also works really well in a dirty river too.
Brilliant. We've talked for over an hour now, Fred, and we're going to start to wind things down. It's been really fascinating getting a look into your life as well as the streamer fishing as well. This has sort of gone in a really interesting, as somebody talking to you, direction, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. But what would your top tip be for someone looking to improve their streamer fishing? What's the advice you think is probably most important that you would, if we haven't covered it, that you think would help someone improve their streamer fishing a little bit more if they were to try it?
I think spend an hour at the end of your day. If you're not a keen or experienced streamer fisherman, if you're on the river and you spent the day dry fly fishing and nymphing or whatever, and you're packing up and it's sort of dusk, put on a streamer and fish for an extra half an hour, 45 minutes into the dark, and give it a go, because I can pretty much guarantee you'll get some sort of action. If it's a small fish coming to have a look and you're getting a little jab, it is amazing how hard these fish hit these flies sometimes, and that's what really took me by surprise the first time. So give it a go. There's no wrong way to do it, actually. Fish into cover, fish fast water, likely looking ambush spots for those fish, and just give it a go. There's no wrong way to do it.
Brilliant. Fred, this has been absolutely fantastic. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you. You mentioned you posted on your...
Well, thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. You mentioned that you posted on your Instagram. What are your social media handles? How do people find you? How do they get hold of you?
So at flyfishing_UK is my Instagram. Give me a message on there if you want to get in touch with me, or find me on Facebook, Fred Brown. Yeah.
Fantastic, Fred. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. If you've been listening, hopefully this has inspired you to have a go at streamers if you haven't already. But I'd like to thank you, Fred, once more for being a guest on the Fly Culture podcast today.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Cheers, Pete.
You're welcome. Thank you, everyone, again for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. Perhaps if you're enjoying these, you'll consider subscribing. As ever, there'll be another one next week. And I always try and vary the content for you to make it interesting, relevant, and try not to go down too many wormholes. So I hope you enjoy listening to these. But I'd like to thank you so much for listening to the Fly Culture podcast. Thanks very much indeed.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.